Welcome back to CIA Declassified. It is July 1962. The world is locked in the grip of the Cold War, and the space race has become a scramble for the ultimate high ground. In the offices of the Atomic Energy Commission, the plan is simple but apocalyptic. To see what happens when you set off a sun-sized explosion on the very edge of the void. Imagine standing on a beach in Waikiki at 11 o'clock at night. The air is warm, the palm trees are swaying, and the Pacific is dark. Suddenly, the sky doesn't just light up, it explodes into a kaleidoscope of blood red, electric green, and brilliant white. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was the artificial aurora created by STARFISH-PRIME. While citizens in Hawaii marveled at the lights, street lights began to pop, telephone lines went dead, and garage doors started opening on their own. This was the first time the world truly felt the invisible punch of an EMP. Picture the moisture in the tropical air suddenly illuminated by a flash so intense it cast shadows of the palm fronds onto the sand, sharper than the midday sun. The silence of the ocean is interrupted not by sound but by the electronic groan of a world being stripped of its insulation. High above, the very air is being cooked into a soup of ionized gas glowing with a ghostly, unnatural magenta. It is the sound of a billion electrons being slapped across the face of the planet. A silent, searing, invisible wind that ignores walls, ignores skin, and seeks out only the heart of the machines we've come to depend on. Visualize the control room on Johnston-Island. Scientists in white lab coats and military officers with sweat-stained collars watch banks of oscilloscopes. They aren't just looking for a blast, they are looking for electronic kill ratios. This was the era of the Thor rocket, a time when we weren't just exploring space, we were weaponizing it. The goal was to understand how a high-altitude burst could strip the electromagnetic armor off the planet, leaving the Soviet Union defenseless against a follow-up strike. Why the name STARFISH-PRIME? The Starfish designation was a randomized code word within the Operation Fishbowl series. However, insiders often joked that it was chosen because the explosion's energy tendrils spread out through the magnetic fields like the arms of a celestial sea creature. The prime suffix was added after the first attempt, Starfish, was a catastrophic failure, resulting in the rocket being blown up by range safety and raining radioactive debris over the Pacific. STARFISH-PRIME was the successful successor. We are pulling back the lead shielding on a project that tested the limits of the atmosphere. STARFISH-PRIME was a high-altitude nuclear test conducted by the United States on July 9, 1962. The warhead had a yield of 1.4 megatons. The explosion created a massive electromagnetic pulse. Records show that the EMP knocked out 300 streetlights in Honolulu. The test damaged or destroyed at least 6 satellites, including Telstar 1. Documentation confirms that the blast created an artificial radiation belt that persisted for years. The project utilized magnetic field mapping to predict aurora locations. Records show the explosion was visible in New Zealand. The test demonstrated that a nuclear blast in space creates no atmospheric shockwave. Documentation reveals the use of sounding rockets to measure electron density. The agency monitored Soviet radio blackouts following the test. Records verify that the EMP caused a microwave link failure in Hawaii. The project proved that nuclear radiation in space could brittle solar cells. Documentation confirms that the blast disturbed the Van Allen radiation belts. The test utilized declassified spectroscopy to analyze fission products. Records show the Thor rocket carried a diagnostic package that was vaporized. The project mapped the magnetic spheric injections of electrons. Documentation reveals the Atomic Energy Commission timed the blast for an orbital window. The system identified that the E1 pulse was too fast for standard for standard surge protectors. Records verify the blast created a plasma cloud expanding at thousands of miles per second. The tool measured the X-ray output to see how it affected satellite sensors. STARFISH-PRIME created a new radiation layer dangerous for space travel. Documentation shows the military used ground-based magnetometers to track Earth currents. The agency utilized clandestine monitoring stations in the Marshall Islands. Records confirm the test part of Operation Dominique. The test proved an EMP could be a non-kinetic weapon. Documentation reveals the blast ionized the air, making high-frequency radio impossible for hours. The project discovered beta decay was the primary source of long-term radiation. Records verify the explosion drained part of the Earth's natural inner radiation belt. The tool recorded geomagnetic storms triggered by the plasma. Documentation shows the blast compressed the Earth's magnetic field on the sunward side. The system identified hardened electronics as a future necessity. Records show the test leaked radioactive iodine into high-altitude jet streams. The project mapped the synchrotron radiation from trapped electrons. Documentation reveals the test was monitored by the USS Wheeling. The test created magnetic bubbles in the ionosphere lasting 30 minutes. Records confirm the EMP was more powerful than pre-shot calculations. The project used photography planes to capture the initial flash. Documentation reveals the blast modified the Schumann resonance. The system identified that vacuum tubes were more resistant to EMP than transistors. Records show that the test blew out the power grid on Kauai. The project resulted in the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Documentation confirms radiation signatures were detectable decades later. The blast created transient radiation effects on electronics known as TREE. Records verify the test saturated detectors on monitoring satellites. The project proved nuclear weapons are more efficient at creating EMP in space. Documentation reveals the agency tracked Soviet ELINT ships nearby. The system measured deionization rates to predict communication downtime. Records show the blast created auroral hiss picked up by the VLF receivers. The project identified the horizontal component of the magnetic field as most affected. Documentation confirms the use of B-57 Canberra bombers for sampling. The test demonstrated the three distinct phases, E1, E2, and E3. Records verify the E3 pulse caused the Hawaiian power grid damage. The weapon destroyed the Ariel 1 satellite, Britain's first satellite. Records show the Engine 1 satellite was also rendered inoperable by the trapped electrons. The test produced fission debris that stayed in orbit for years as space junk. Documentation confirms the device used a W-49 warhead integrated into the re-entry vehicle. The burst point was 13.3 degrees north latitude. Records show the explosion altitude was precisely 400 kilometers. The test caused magnetic field oscillations that were detected as far away as France. Documentation reveals the detonation time was 0900 hours UTC. The system recorded teletype failures across the Pacific Basin during the E1 phase. Records verify that the artificial radiation belt had a higher flux than the natural belts. The project mapped the conjugate points where electrons entered the atmosphere. Documentation shows the Thor rocket guidance system survived the initial ascent but was dead on detonation. The test resulted in the discovery of satellite blinding thresholds for infrared sensors. Records show the L shell of the trapped radiation reached as high as L 1.12. The project utilized magnetohydrodynamic codes to simulate the blast expansion. Documentation confirms the visible expansion velocity was approximately 1,000 kilometers per second. The system identified ionospheric heaving as a side effect of the thermal energy. Records verify that the test caused shortwave radio fadeouts that lasted for 2 days in some sectors. The test created telluric currents in undersea cables between the US and Japan. Documentation reveals that scientists used the Argus effect theory to predict electron trapping. The project mapped the plasma diamagnetism of the expanding bubble. Records show that the test perturbed the F layer of the ionosphere globally. The system recorded atmospheric luminescence that was photographed from the international dateline. Documentation confirms the test redistributed the population of the inner proton belt. The test proved that hard X-rays from the burst create a secondary EMP upon hitting the atmosphere. Records verify that the blast was the highest altitude man-made explosion in the 20th century. The project identified that shielding weight would be the primary constraint for future space-based intelligence assets. Documentation reveals that the Joint Task Force 8 was responsible for the operational execution. The system recorded secondary flash effects from the airglow of excited oxygen atoms. Records show the test deafened certain low-frequency submarine communication arrays. The project confirmed that orbital lifetimes of satellites are drastically shortened by radiation-induced drag. Documentation confirms that the STARFISH-PRIME data is still used by the NASA Space Environments team today. The blast caused a synchrotron emission that was audible on radio telescopes in Australia. Records show that the test released a cadmium-109 tracer to study the circulation of the stratosphere. The project identified that dielectric breakdown was the primary cause of satellite antenna failure. Documentation reveals the detonation produced a self-generated magnetic field that briefly buckled the Earth's local field lines. The system recorded that the artificial radiation decayed at a rate much slower than the initial McLwain calculations suggested, McLLwain. Records verify that the test caused a global ionospheric dip that interfered with transatlantic telegraphy for 48 hours. The test demonstrated that gamma-ray scattering is the catalyst for the E1 pulse component. Documentation confirms that the blast was powerful enough to create secondary auroras in the southern hemisphere near the magnetic conjugate point. The detonation triggered a MHD shockwave that traveled along magnetic field lines to the opposite hemisphere in seconds. Records show the artificial belt increased the background radiation for low Earth orbit by a factor of 100. Documentation reveals the test caused the permanent failure of the track satellite's power system. The project identified that the E2 pulse resembles lightning but covers a continent-sized area. Records verified that the fission fragment cloud remained visible to specialized sensors for over 45 minutes. The system recorded phase shifts in very low frequency radio waves used for military navigation, VLF. Documentation confirms that the explosion created a cold plasma tail that extended thousands of kilometers into the magnetosphere. The test proved that hard vacuum conditions amplify the distance an EMP can travel without attenuation. Records show that the blast stripped electrons from the atmosphere, creating a temporary vacuum gap in the ionosphere. The project confirmed that a 1.4 megaton space burst provides enough X-ray flux to damage unshielded optics on spy satellites. The explosion created a Whistler mode radio signal that propagated from the Pacific to the South Atlantic in under a second. Records reveal that the test accidentally caused a geomagnetic substorm that was detectable by compasses in Alaska. Documentation confirms that the fireball from the blast was actually a plasma bubble that rose 100 kilometers in less than a minute. The test proved that thermal X-rays in a vacuum convert into kinetic energy of the bomb debris with nearly 100% efficiency. Records show the blast created an infrared afterglow in the mesosphere that persisted for several hours. The project identified that the artificial belt electrons were moving at 99% the speed of light. Documentation confirms that the test resulted in the first ever space-to-ground spectroscopic analysis of a man-made nuclear plasma. Just as a side note, I am a huge proponent of nuclear power. It's the only power that can be used infinitely, essentially. Just throwing that out there. Okay, on to the quotes. Here's one from an eyewitness on Oahu, whose name isn't written. It just says eyewitness on Oahu. It was as if the sun had risen at midnight and then decided to turn into 1,000 neon rainbows. Quote from a declassified technical analysis dated October 1962, the STARFISH-PRIME detonation resulted in a much higher intensity of trapped electrons than had been predicted, leading to the early demise of several orbiting vehicles. Quote from a declassified internal briefing dated 1962, we are no longer just testing a bomb, we are testing the durability of the planet's electronic nervous system. Quote from a CIA Office of Scientific Intelligence research report that's been declassified. The electromagnetic pulse produced by high-altitude bursts can potentially paralyze a nation's military and civilian infrastructure without direct blast damage. Quote from a declassified memo to the Director of Central Intelligence, but it doesn't say who sent it. Our monitoring satellites were effectively blinded by the very event they were sent to measure. The instrumentation saturation was total. A quote from a declassified special intelligence estimate that's dated 1963, the creation of an artificial radiation belt on this magnitude poses a long-term hazard to manned spaceflight and satellite survivability. Quote from a declassified internal AEC memo, if we do this again, we might not just blind the Soviets, we might blind ourselves for a generation. End quote. While the visuals were public, the data yield remains guarded. The section titled Satellite Vulnerability Matrix is approximately 115 pages of dense redaction. The exemptions being used to protect this information are primarily FOIA Exemption 1, which protects information classified in the interest of national defense or foreign policy, and Exemption 3, which covers information specifically exempted from disclosure by other federal statutes, such as the Atomic Energy Act. What is hidden in that black ink? I suspect those pages cover the Soviet kill list, the specific identities of Russian spy satellites that the agency fried during the test. I also believe the redactions hide the nuclear space denial protocols, the plans for using high-altitude bursts to create permanent dead zones in orbit that would prevent any nation from launching satellites for decades. I also suspect the redactions contain the human radiation thresholds for astronauts, the calculations of how long a pilot and Vostok or Mercury capsule would survive if caught in the artificial belts. When you tear a hole in the sky, the theories start to flood in. For instance, there is the atmospheric ignition panic. At the time, there was a theory that the 1.4 megaton blast might ignite the nitrogen in the atmosphere, causing a runaway fission reaction that would turn the Earth into a second sun. Then there's the alien beacon theory. Some speculate that STARFISH-PRIME wasn't a test for the Soviets, but a signal. The idea is that the high-altitude burst was designed to probe for cloaked extraterrestrial craft hiding in the Earth's magnetic field by painting them with a burst of radiation. Then there's the pole shift theory. This posits that the agency was trying to see if they could trigger a geomagnetic reversal of the North and South poles, using the nuclear pulse to kickstart a shift in the Earth's liquid iron core. And then there's the dimensional rift theory. It's a more modern one that suggests that the specific resonance of the starfish blast was an attempt to punch through the ionospheric barrier to access subspace communications or even to open a temporary wormhole for advanced surveillance. Was Project STARFISH-PRIME a success? Tactically, it was a terrifying triumph. It provided the first hard data on the destructive radius of an EMP. It proved that a single weapon could neutralize an entire region's electronic infrastructure without killing a single person directly. The tactical win was the validation of electronics hardening. It forced the military to stop relying on fragile transistors and return to shielded vacuum tubes for critical systems. By observing the satellite degradation, the agency realized they could clear the skies of enemy eyes with a single push of a button. Strategically, it was a geopolitical gamble that nearly failed, but it didn't fail. While it showed U.S. strength, it also contaminated the very space we wanted to use. The artificial radiation belt damaged our own satellites as much as the Soviets. It led to the 1963 treaty because both superpowers realized that nuclear space war was a self-defeating strategy. It shifted the focus from orbital detonation to ground-based EMP hardening, fundamentally changing how we protect our power grids today. As far as technological and operational breakthroughs go, STARFISH-PRIME led to quite a few, such as electromagnetic pulse modeling, EMP-M, The data gathered from the streetlights of Hawaii and the voltage spikes on the monitors allowed scientists to write the first equations for pulse propagation. Today, this is the foundation of infrastructure resilience. It is used to design Faraday cages for data centers and hospital grids to ensure that a solar flare or a terrorist EMP won't send society back to the Stone Age. The military uses these models to harden command and control bunkers like NORAD, ensuring leadership remains online during a nuclear exchange. The intelligence community uses this data to develop EMP-proof secure facilities for data processing, while industry applies these propagation equations to reinforce the national power grid against geomagnetic disturbances that could cause widespread blackouts. Satellite radiation hardening. The fact that Telstar 1 died because of the starfish radiation forced an immediate revolution in aerospace engineering. Today, every satellite in orbit, from GPS to your satellite internet, uses radiation-hardened circuits and gallium arsenide solar cells, RSENIDE. These technologies allow our digital society to survive the harsh radiation of the natural Van Allen belts, a direct result of the lessons learned when we created an artificial one. The hardening is essential for survivable communications as far as the military is concerned, and their satellites that must remain functional in a radioactive orbital environment during wartime. The intelligence community relies on these hardened circuits as well to keep reconnaissance assets operational under hostile radiation interference. Industry uses the same tech to extend the lifespan of commercial communications and navigation satellites, saving billions in replacement cost. And then there's magnetospheric mapping. By watching how the artificial auroras moved, scientists mapped the invisible cables of the Earth's magnetic field. Today, this is used in space weather forecasting. It allows us to predict when a coronal mass ejection from the sun will hit Earth, giving power companies and airlines time to power down sensitive equipment before the pulse hits. The military uses these maps to predict radio frequency blackouts that might disrupt troop coordination or long-range drone piloting. The intelligence community uses this mapping to identify signals intelligence gaps caused by ionospheric shifts. Industry applies it to prevent massive induced currents from melting undersea fiber optic cables and pipeline infrastructure. Then we have transient radiation effects on electronics. The discovery that radiation can cause logic upsets, where a computer forgets a piece of data without being physically destroyed, was a major breakthrough. Today, this is the basis for error correcting code memory, ECC. It is used in everything from self-driving cars to deep space probes to ensure that stray particles don't cause a critical system failure while you're driving or while a probe is landing on Mars. The military uses this. It's integrated into missile guidance systems and nuclear command terminals to prevent bit flips from triggering erroneous launches or navigational errors. The intelligence community utilizes tree-aware design to maintain data integrity in high-altitude surveillance aircraft. Industry incorporates it into financial server farms and medical imaging tech, where a single corrupted bit could lead to catastrophic failure. The legacy of STARFISH-PRIME is the end of electronic innocence. We learned that the technological web we have built is draped over a nuclear powder keg. The star that shattered taught us that the higher we watch, the more fragile our connection to the world becomes. As we look at the magenta sky of 1962, we must realize that the invisible wind never truly stopped blowing. It is still there, lurking in the potential of every warhead and the fury of every solar flare. We have built a world of glass and light, hoping that the sledgehammer of physics never swings again. But in the silence of the ionosphere, the artificial radiation whispers a warning. What man can create, man can just as easily unmake. We are a species that has learned to harness the fire of the stars, only to realize that we are standing in a house of cards. The data points from Johnston-Island are not just historical facts. They are the blueprints of our modern vulnerability. Every time you glance at your phone, remember that its signal exists at the mercy of the magnetic lines we once tried to break. The night sky is not just a view, it is the front line of a quiet war for the survival of the machine. Never trust the stability of the grid during a geomagnetic event. Remember that analog backup is not obsolete. In a digital conflict, the winner is the one who can go dark. And remember, the sky is not a shield, it is a lens. Thanks for listening, and join us next time as we investigate MK Truth, the neurological frontier where the agency developed truth serums to break the high-stakes target. We'll look at the barbiturate blends, the disorientation protocols, and the ethical void where the mind becomes a leaking sieve. Join us next time for the liquid key. In the meantime, I'll see you in the archives.